I am honoured to be able to introduce our keynote speaker today, our first keynote speaker of the conference. Winnie Lee, would you like to join me now? Winnie is many things: an author, an activist, and a rape survivor. She's a Harvard graduate and a George Mitchell Scholar. Winnie worked as a film producer in London before her life was disrupted by a violent stranger rape in a Belfast park. Her debut novel, Dark Chapter, is a fictional retelling of that event. It has been translated into 10 languages and won the Guardian's Not the Booker Prize and was nominated for an Edgar Award. She is currently adapting it for the screen. Her second novel, Complicit, which we talked about last night, No Alibis, was published this summer and was selected for the New York Times Group Text Monthly Book Club. Winnie is also co-founder of the Clear Lines Festival, the UK's first ever festival addressing sexual assault and consent through the arts and discussion. Her ongoing PhD research at the London School of Economics explores media engagement by rape survivors as a form of activism. Winnie, we are delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I think it's appropriate to start with the aptly named Dark Chapter, described by The Guardian as a defiant retelling of personal trauma. Would you like to do a short reading for us?
Sure, absolutely. I'm going to go straight into it. Obviously, I mean, trigger warning for the entire conference, but you know, the prologue was designed to be, well, we can talk a bit more about how it came about, but it can be potentially triggering or not. And then we'll talk a bit more about it. But yeah, this, you might recognize the area where it's set. It's Colin Glen Forest Park in the west of Belfast. They say events like this change your life forever, that your life will never be the same as it was the day before it happened, or even 2 hours before it happened, when I stood waiting for that bus out of Belfast, along the Falls Road to the west of the city. Is it melodramatic to think of life like that, of a clean split struck straight down the breadth of your existence, severing your first 29 years from all the years that came after? I look across that gap now, an unexpected rift in the contour of my life, and I long to shout across that ravine to the younger me who stands on the opposite edge, oblivious to what lies ahead. She is a distant speck. She seems lost from my perspective, but in her mind, she thinks she knows where she's going. There's a hiking guidebook in her hand and a path that she is following. It will lead here up this slope and then along the edge of a plateau to gain the higher ground merging with the hills above the city. She does not know who follows her. She's only thinking of the path ahead. But some things she cannot anticipate. I stand now on this side of the ravine, desperate to warn my earlier self of the person trailing her, skulking from bush to tree in her wake. Stop, I want to shout. It's not worth it. Just give up the trail and go home. But she wouldn't listen anyway. She's too stubborn, too determined to hike this trail on a day this crisp and clear. And now, it's too late. She is an isolated country, and even if she were to turn back, she would inevitably encounter him, because he is behind her, watching her. By now, she's traversed the slope and found the trail which runs between a sunlit pasture and the steep incline of the glen. She pauses for a moment, breathing in the beauty of the screen track, the tree branches arching over the path, the bright field which stretches to her left. She's escaped the city finally. This is where the countryside really begins. It seems like a little bit of heaven for one last peaceful moment. But she's perched on the edge, and to her right, the ground plunges sharply into the ravine. The River Colin is a distant roar. The air up here smells of manure and sun and warm grass, and lazy insects drift in the filtered light beneath the trees. And then, glancing down the wooded chasm to her right, she sees him coming up the slope, trying to hide in the brush of the forest. Something skips unnaturally in the beat of her heart. Only then does she realize she's being followed. Now, years later, it's as if I am the one following my earlier self, haunting her every step like some guardian angel arrived too late, She parts the branches in front of her, and I do it too, invisibly. She quickens her pace to lengthen the distance between him, and I fall in step. She instinctively knows she must reach the open ground before he catches her, so she tries to cover the last few yards of the path as it clears a ridge. With an invisible hand, I want to hold back the little bastard, lock him into position like a rugby player, while shouting to her to keep on going, to reach the meadow and then abandon the trail. Forget about the hike, just head straight to the busy road and go home. But I am powerless to stop it. Events must unfold, as they already have. The past is our past, so I am stranded here on this side of the ravine, watching as he catches up to her. I don't want to see the rest of it. I've replayed it enough times already. If I could just freeze it there, in that final moment, perched between the sunlit pasture and the plunging abyss, then everything would still be fine. Only then, it would not be my life. It would be someone else's pleasant stroll through the Irish countryside on a spring afternoon. But my journey turned out to be a little different.
Thank you, Heaney. That's very powerful. Often we talk in writing about writing what we know and what we've lived, but in this book you took a very risky sort of choice and a very powerful choice in also writing your perpetrator's viewpoint. How did you find that, and why did you choose to do that?
So for me, it was necessary to try to make sense of why my perpetrator did what he did. So just to give you a little bit of background on that section I wrote, I wrote it actually just a few weeks after my assault. So my assault took place on April 14th, 2008 in Glen Forest Park. And I was followed by a I describe him as a young boy, who's a 15-year-old boy. And yeah, and I won't go too much into details because that's in the book, but for me, I possibly was walking into a situation where I didn't really expect what was going to happen because he was so young. And I think in the news reports afterwards, like the shocking element that was in the news headlines was teenage rapist, right? He was so young, right? So that is the striking thing about that particular news story, my story, right? So in the weeks after, obviously, I had quite serious post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression, and like any victim out there, I think you're stuck thinking, how did that happen? How did I let that happen? Obviously, it's not without your consent, but many victims feel like they played some part in enabling that to happen because it's such a cruel stroke of fate. Obviously, that's not true because it's all on the perpetrator. But for me, I kept on thinking about this 15-year-old boy I didn't know, walked into my life and completely destroyed it, right? So I sat down and I was in this state of shock for months, basically, probably years. And then I started writing, and those paragraphs just sort of came out, right? And I remember thinking oh, it's actually pretty good writing, right? And so in the midst of all that, when I felt like I was completely destroyed as a person, I was like, if I can actually still write that, which is pretty good, then maybe somewhere deep down, I am still me, right? Because I'd always loved writing. It was always very important to me. So I remember thinking okay, somewhere down the line, I want to write a story or write a book where it delves into these two people who were so different, right? This 15-year-old illiterate Irish traveler boy who happens to cross paths, or maybe he deliberately seeks to cross paths with me, who was a 29-year-old Asian American who was here at the tail end of a George Mitchell Scholar Conference and decided to go for a walk one day in Glen Forest Park. And we came from such different worlds, and I saw I had actually many more opportunities in my life because of my education and the way I was raised versus my perpetrator. So I wouldn't say I felt sorry for him, but I was just aware of the fact that he not had from what I could tell, he hadn't had a life that had a huge amount of joy or encouragement or opportunity in it. So I kind of wanted to try to make sense of what he had done and try to think what would it be like to be 15 years old and to think that that you get a sense of power from doing this to another person, a complete stranger that you see in a park. What would be the reason you would do that? And does he have any idea of the impact that his actions had on my life? So that was a central question, this idea of two very different lives that crossed paths in this single moment of violence. Quite long for me. It's actually a 30-minute long attack. But anyway, 30-minute long attack of violence, and then the aftermath, and looking at how both those lives were affected by that violence. So that involves delving into the character of Johnny. His real life name isn't obviously Johnny. And I just wanted to kind of create his character and try to make him real and three-dimensional because, as Hilary had mentioned before, oftentimes victims are seen as being kind of this, this nameless other, and there's a tendency to think like, oh, rapists are just like inhuman monsters that are like beyond the pale of humanity, whereas to be in reality, like, rapists walk amongst us, and their fathers and brothers and bosses and all that. So, and in this case, because he was a 15-year-old Irish traveler, it was quite easy for people to draw a line and say like, oh, he's not one of us. But, he was raised in a society and, like, and he learned certain values about women and, and sex from society in some ways. So for me, I wanted to really delve into his voice and try to bring it to life and add an element of humanity to a character that would often be reviled, and for quite understandable reasons, but I felt like if we don't try to understand the roots of that kind of behavior, then we're never going to be able to stop violence against women and girls from happening in the first place.
Last night, No Alibis, I was quite shocked when you said after the rape, you tried to continue in your job as film producer. You got on a plane within 2 days, one day?
The day after the rape,
the day after, to go do a red carpet event. Did you find yourself sort of almost working on autopilot, or were you trying to contain what happened in some way?
I mean, I think I was in so much shock. I wouldn't use the word contain, but yeah, I was definitely on autopilot. I definitely went to survival mode, and I think that, again, that's the case for any victim survivor out there. Because you're so much in shock about what happens to you that you're just like, okay, in some ways I'm just going to sort of carry on with the life I knew before and go through the motions of it. And I often describe myself as having felt like I was a shell of a person, right? Like I'd just sort of been gouged out from the inside. So, anybody who saw me externally might think, yeah, I mean, she's functioning fine, but in reality, I just was completely vacant. So yeah, I mean, that is what trauma does to you. That's what sexual violence does to you. So yeah, and I think, but it's that's also quite, I mean, I don't know if you use the word dangerous, but that's quite difficult for the rest of society to see somebody who's seemingly like normal and just say like, oh no, yeah, I mean, if she seemed fine, right? Like, she wasn't actually raped. Like, it's hard I think, for us to kind of make sense of the fact that rape and sexual violence is such a damaging and destructive impact on us, and yet at the same time we are still capable of carrying on and seemingly appearing normal, and that actually can be difficult to access the help that you need, or for people to even believe that that you need the help, right? So that's kind of this double-edged sword of, on one hand, you want to carry on and pretend to be surviving. On the other hand, people don't actually see you as being vulnerable or needing help. And I certainly had that case when I was trying to get mental health support with through the NHS and my GPS, like my GP sent me to be assessed by some board, right, to see if I needed mental health support. And the referral letter came back and said, oh, Winnie seems like a fine, bubbly young woman. Perhaps she doesn't actually need help. And I'm like, no, I need help. Like, I'm sorry I present as an articulate person, but like, I know when I'm not normal right at the moment, or I don't feel like I'm normal. So I had to go back and push back and be like, no, I actually need mental health support, and this woman doesn't know me, and she probably thinks I present fine. So I think there is a double-edged sword between our desire to want to survive and appear presentable and the fact that we actually need help. And then society as well doesn't have that kind of insight into that divide.
And you had difficulty getting the book published. Not that publishers were not interested, they were, but they saw it as a risky undertaking. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's so many stories. And again, so I guess you can draw a parallel to this need for normality, right, versus the actual reality of trauma and the impact of trauma, right? So, oh my God, where to start with Dark Chapter, right? So I started writing Dark Chapter in 2013, right? So that was 5.5 years after the assault. And I have to stress, a lot of people say like, oh, did it help you recover writing the book? I'm like, no, I mean, I had to recover first, and then I wrote the book, right? I know other people that do it differently, but for me, my number one priority was recovering and trying to rebuild my life out of the pieces that had been the pieces that had been kind of reduced to as a result of the assault. So, 5.5 years, and I couldn't find a job for a long time. That led to further depression. I ended up finding a job moving to Doha, where the World Cup is currently happening, programming for the Tribeca Film Festival there. And it was a completely clean slate. Like, nobody in that country knew what had happened to me. I made a whole new set of friends, which was great in some ways, but also was quite tough, because if I needed to speak to someone, there wasn't anyone I could talk to, because nobody had known I'd gone through this traumatic rape. So again, that was like me presenting this normal facade, and maybe that's what recovery is, but the reality of my trauma, I couldn't actually speak to anyone about. Anyway, so got another job in Singapore, and then eventually in 2013, I moved back to London to start my creative writing masters at Goldsmiths, because I knew by that point I was ready to write that book that I'd thought of, 5 years earlier. Sorry, what was the original question? I was going somewhere.
Yeah, the difficulty of getting it published.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, started writing the book, and so by 2015, I had started. We were querying publishers, right? So by that point, I got an agent, and then my agent had gotten what's called a preemptive offer from one of the big 5 publishers, and they're like, "Oh, we love this book; it's really important. We're strong feminists, et cetera, et cetera." And so that was great, and I was like overjoyed. And they said all these wonderful things about my book, but then somewhere in the negotiation process, they came back and they said, and I had raised an issue to my agent where I was concerned about all the publicity that they were expecting me to do for the book, as a survivor or a victim of rape, like that, that might be quite difficult for me to be doing that much publicity, or it would be a challenge. I didn't say I didn't want to do it. I was just worried about kind of the mental health impacts on me, which I think is a valid point, right? And that was, that was a while ago. I can do that now, but that was before I'd become so kind of media, I suppose so media practiced the way I am now in 2022. So my agent, maybe, I guess she raised that to the publisher, and the publisher came back and they said, well, we expect all our debut authors to do a lot of publicity, and we're aware of the psychological toll that we'll have on Winnie as a victim of rape. So we don't want that on our conscience, and we're going to withdraw the offer of publication. So I went from thinking I was going to have this book published and being overjoyed to suddenly being like, wait, I don't actually have a book deal? I'm like, but what? How could they just do that, right? And they did that, and and that was their explanation. Maybe there was a real reason, but they kind of did it in this sort of patronizing, we're looking after your health, therefore we're not going to publish your book, which is hard, it's heartbreaking for any author, right? Especially for somebody who's sharing their personal trauma in the book, right? So that was terrifying. Well, not terrifying, it was completely depressing. I found out on my birthday. I was depressed for months, right? And then later on, we did get a much smaller offer from an independent publisher, also feminist. They do great work. And so we got the offer, et cetera, et cetera. Hadn't signed the contract yet. And then they're like, actually, we're a bit worried of being sued for libel by your real life perpetrator. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm writing this as fiction. And he was convicted, he confessed, right? And they're like, yeah, but we're a small press, and if any legal action were to happen, we wouldn't be able to afford the legal fees, so we're gonna have to withdraw the offer of publication. So I was like, what? And again, I was distraught. I'm speaking to English Pen to try to get some support here, but at the end of the day, if they don't want to take on that legal risk, then they don't have to publish your book. So that took, it was really soul destroying for me at the time. To have put all this effort into running a book, into thinking, and I've been offered twice publication and then suddenly having that withdrawn. Eventually we did find a different publisher, and it did get published. But yeah, it was a long journey, and it was, again, all these different, that kind of the need for normality of having to do the publicity versus these unexpected impacts of not the trauma necessarily on me, but on the way people wanted to publish this story and how they were scared of the issue in certain ways and the legal implications of it. But then that all ended up coming back to me and kind of reinforcing my trauma in some ways.
Absolutely. Thinking about the themes of today's conference, strength, resilience, creative activism, I'm just interested to know what creative activism means to you, Winnie. You've almost lived and embodied your creative activism. But through your PhD work, you're taking a different direction, looking at mainstream media representations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I am doing my PhD very slowly in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. I started my PhD in 2015, right, which was the year I started the Clear Lines Festival, which we'll speak about in a bit, and that was also the year that we went out to publishers with Dark Chapter. So I think in some ways, I started the PhD almost as a backup in case their writing career didn't work out. Because, you know, I mean, as you would know, for authors, it's always a risky proposition to like put all of your effort into writing a book. The difficult, you know, it's so hard to get a book deal. You don't know if that's ever going to turn into anything more like sustainable afterwards. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll get a PhD just in case it doesn't work out. And then I did get quite busy with writing, and so I am still doing the PhD in 2022. And I had to like move to part-time study and, you know, take some time off, and then I had a baby along the way. So that kind of drew everything out. But for me, yeah, it's been interesting exploring the issue from a social sciences perspective at the London School of Economics, which is a very social sciences institute. Because I am ultimately a creative person, I'm an arts and humanities person, like suddenly I'm in this place where you have to use a social science approach. So it was a whole new like methodology that I had to learn. But it did kind of really open my eyes to sort of the political economy and the economic reality of sexual violence, you know, within in industry spaces like the creative industries, or even just for activists, right? So my research is looking at rape survivors who are engaging with the media, who, you know, speak about their experience, you know, on television or on the radio or write about it, and why they choose to do that, and do they see it as a form of activism? So, you know, I now at this point know a lot of people who do that, but, you know, some of the issues I'm looking at are the emotional labor of that, because it is quite exhausting to do that over and over, like on television, on radio, and so it takes a whole new sort of communicative set of skills to be able to do that and to sustain doing that and to deal with kind of the emotional impact of doing that in some ways. And then is that seen as actual labor within the creative industries? Like, is that actually being compensated? So in a lot of ways, in a lot of times, it's not being compensated. I did a kind of preview screening of She Said, the film, which is out now, 2-3 days ago, with Rowena Chu, whose story is in She Said. And so she's one of the women who was assaulted by Weinstein, used to be his assistant, and she was silenced by an NDA for 20 years. And then her story came out in the book She Said, and then the New York Times. And she doesn't get paid for any of her media work, right? And so that's a full-time job for her at this point, right? And yet she's not being paid. So there's something like quite off about that, I find, right? There's something quite off about the amount of effort that survivors are putting into sharing their story in the media, the fact that that's being used as content by media platforms, like really good, unique media content, and then that's not being compensated, right? And is that partially because survivors are happy to do it as a public good, as a work of activism, and yet if they aren't being paid for it, does that actually ultimately mean only certain survivors can sustain that? I.e., does that have to do with class and cultural capital? And if you don't have to earn a living, then yes, you can do that, and that doesn't undermine the amount of impact, the amount of effort that goes into it. But does that essentially mean if you're working class and you're trying to support 5 children and you don't have a partner, that you can't do that kind of work? And therefore, does that mean we're leaving out certain voices from that entire conversation in the media? So that's the kind of stuff I'm looking at in my research, yeah.
Very good. Maya Angelou stated that there is no agony, no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. And it made me think of the Susan Bryson quote: in order to construct self-narratives, we not only need words with which to tell our stories, but also an audience willing to listen. I think that's very important. So in this part of bearing witness, of being seen and heard, how has that been important to you? And do you get an almost creative energy back? Is it worth your while telling your story?
You mean speaking out about it? Is it worth? Yeah, of course it's worth my while. I mean, do I get a creative energy back? Probably not so much a creative energy, but an emotional connection back, because it's in some of the bonds I've forged with other survivors, especially kind of activist survivors, in the work that I've done over the past years I mean, those are some of the closest friendships that we have. And because we all sort of understand, like, the media will say this about survivors, or, you know, or people will treat us like this way, or like someone's always going to say, oh, this happened to my friend, can you speak to them? That kind of thing. And these are all aspects of the work that we do, and they all involve emotional labor. And in some ways, we're all still willing to do it because we know it's so important, right? So, I mean, does that creatively charge me myself? Probably not, although obviously engagement with the media shows up in both my novels. But it's more about kind of the camaraderie, I suppose, or the solidarity that comes from being in these sorts of survivor spaces with people who are being creative in the way that we become activists. You asked earlier, what is creative activism about? And like, there's different forms of activism. You can go on a protest. Obviously, there's a march tomorrow night. You know, I have friends who try to change policy, and so they work with different government bodies in terms of changing policy. Obviously, you can be, you know, at university researching sexual violence from a legal perspective, or a medical perspective, or a psychological one. And I guess for me, it was trying to find like the best space for me in terms of, if I want to create change on this issue, what is the best, not the best use of my skills, but what is also the most interesting for me. And for me, that's the arts, that's creativity. That, because I used to work as a film producer, I've always wanted to write. So storytelling and you know, using fiction to explore these issues has always been kind of the route I want to go down. So for me, being able to be creative while also trying to be an activist around this issue is what's creatively fulfilling for me. That becomes kind of the positive feedback loop, I suppose, because even when I was writing Johnny in Dark Chapter, like, you know, he's not a pleasant character, and when I was writing his scenes, like, you know, I did feel sorry for him in some ways, and yeah, and I also wanted to find an element of empathy in what was possibly a quite grim life for the fictional character. I don't know the real life person, and so in some ways there was a sadness there, but then also just being able to create at the same time was quite fulfilling for me as an artist, right? So that ability to explore the issue, which is a heavy and sad issue, but also to do it through the arts, is a positive one, it's a productive one. It does make you feel like you've accomplished something, or that you've explored something through storytelling, which is, I think, the important thing for me as an artist.
The Clear Lines Festival originated really in response to the Blurred Lines song.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through that, how it came about, what it involved, and the amount of work that you had to put into it?
Yeah, and I think that was probably the clearest example of creative activism. I mean, so that came about 7 years after my assault, so 2015. And so by then I'd started paying attention, like I'd been about, like, I was about a year and a half after starting my master's. And when I started my master's, I like quit all my jobs. Again, I was lucky, speaking about money, because I think we need to talk about money and the ability to sustain our creative activism. I quit my job about a year and a half earlier to start my master's in creative writing and to write Dark Chapter. And so for me, it was quite liberating to be like, oh, I don't have to like do any other jobs. I can literally just focus on the writing and on this issue. But I had found that writing a novel is a quite isolating process. You know, as a writer, you're just there. It's just you and your computer typing away. I was obviously doing research for Dark Chapter. I came to Belfast to research for it, which was a terrifying prospect in itself, to be returning to the city, which is so closely associated with my rape. But yeah, for me, that was all part of the process, the journey, I suppose, right? Yeah, I started to realize it was quite isolating. At the same time, I realized that there were a lot of other artists, survivors out there, who were creating art about this issue. I'd written a short play, which was at a theater festival, a fringe theater festival in London, and the whole, it's like 3-4 days of just theater around sexual abuse and violence, right? And I'm like, wow, and this was really good work. I'm like, there's other people writing about this. And of course, I started to pay attention to different artistic representations of sexual violence. So I was like, well, there's actually some really good stuff out there being created by survivors, but I hadn't seen a place where that could all be brought together and seen. So I was like, someone should start a festival about this. I'm like, I'll do that, right? Because I'd run a film festival in Doha for years at that point, right? So I'm like, yeah, I know how to put a festival together. And I'm like, yeah, and I kind of know, like, from a kind of curatorial perspective, I know the artists out there creating this work, or I know who they are. So yeah, myself and Dr. Nina Burrows, whom some of you might be aware of, she does a lot of work in this area as well. She's a psychologist, and a number of other activists, including On Road Media. They're a nonprofit that specializes in improving the media representation of I suppose, certain issues by empowering the voices of marginalized groups. They worked with us as well. So we were all kind of like the founding members of this festival, and it was like exactly the 7th anniversary of my rape, and I'm like, okay, we're gonna do this festival this year. And then 3.5 months later, we had done the festival, or we delivered it, but it was very much like, it was very scrappy, it was very grassroots. I'm like, okay, let's crowdfund for it. And we managed to get £7,000, which was enough to do the festival. We kind of did all these different sort of videos that we shot and cut together. And I found there was so much passion out there from other survivors. Maybe they didn't identify publicly as survivors, or other advocates who cared about the issue and had all different sorts of skills. Like some were graphic designers and some were, filmmakers and could shoot video and edit it, right? And other people, were willing to be accountants, right? That kind of thing, right? So I'm like, there's so many different skill sets out there. I'm like, okay, let's draw this together and let's create a platform for all the art to be seen. So we had 4 days. And it was, we had like a film showcase, a theater showcase, spoken word, stand-up comedies. And some of you might say, okay, that's a bit strange. Like the media was certainly, can you do stand-up comedy about rape? I'm like, well, there's a lot of feminist stand-up comedians out there who joke about societal attitudes towards gender. And yeah, there's a lot we can poke fun of, a lot of fun that we can make out of like the stupidness of misogyny, right? So basically we delivered it, and we also had different panel discussions throughout the day on what the legal and criminal justice process is like for survivors. How do we speak to how do male survivors deal with their experiences? How do we speak to children about child sexual abuse? So Nina kind of programmed those panels, and I took care of the artistic stuff. And we had a lot of volunteers that wanted to help out. So over the 4 days, we had about like 300 or 400 people come. We were on Channel 4 News. I mean, so it was all kind of quite great to be like, okay, no, the energy is out there, and there are people that want to engage with this art, largely because they're survivors or they know someone or they're advocates in some way, and to create a place for this art to be seen. And we always had a Q&A afterwards where the artist, who was often a survivor, could talk about the whole artistic process, and they could, the audience could ask them questions. So for me, that kind of interface and that space for building community was really important, because I'd seen that missing. Like obviously there's group therapy and that sort of thing, but I'm talking about sort of a stage after that where it's about, let's create art, let's use our kind of creativity and our capacity for recovery through community and through the arts as a means to bring people together, right? And so I'd never seen that more kind of positive celebratory spin on the capacity for recovery from sexual violence. It was always the dark stuff. It was always like, let's change policy. And I'm like, no, there needs to be a more human element to this. So that's what we did for Clear Lines the first year. 2 years later, we did a 3-day festival, and then we kind of moved to like one-off events in London. And I started running creative writing workshops with survivors of sexual violence and abuse. Claire Shaw, who's a fantastic award-winning poet, devised a online writing resource which you can download from the Clear Lines website for free. So we started running different workshops. We got funding from the Royal Society of Literature and from Arts Council Northern Ireland. I just did a series of workshops for Nexus NI. So that's all kind of sort of the legacy of Clear Lines. I think at this point, because we never actually got a serious chunk of funding, to sustain the organization. And because at this point I got so busy with my writing and I just had to make a decision, actually the writing is more important for me, that's more fulfilling for me, that's the career I want to have versus like running an arts organization. So I just kind of made that decision. It's still there, we still have a good newsletter. If we decide to do an event, that's something we could probably still do and pull together and have a lot of people that want to come. I mean, it does take a lot of effort to do these sorts of things, yeah.
Part of my work, I'm very much interested in landscape and the body and the metaphors that go around that. And it was very striking to me in your TEDx talk, you took a similar approach. You're a traveller, you love exploring, and you brought those two sort of together within that TEDx talk, but you also reframed the shame narrative. Can you tell us where you stand on shame? And I just think it's so powerful what you said in that talk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, shame is often a word that is brought into the conversation when we talk about sexual violence, and sort of the expectation is that the victim often feels shame, like it's, we should be ashamed that this happened to us. In my case, I actually never felt that. I think that's because I'm a victim of stranger rape, and I was 29 when it happened, and I was, very well traveled at the time. So I'd gone 29 years, many of it, probably about like 13 of those traveling on my own, and nothing had happened to me, nothing bad had happened to me. So when this happened, I was like, wait, I was just doing the same thing I normally do, and then this guy did this to me. So it was very clear in my mind that I hadn't done anything wrong. Although there was still a few moments where I was like, wait, but did I let him do that to me? I'm like, nah, But again, I had a great police officer who said, no, I mean, that you did not consent to that. And again, if a different police officer had did a different kind of thing, that could have damaged me quite badly. But she was like, no, you did everything you could to survive that situation, and you survived it, right? So I didn't have any shame, and I know that's quite unusual because many other victims do feel shame, particularly if they know the individual who perpetrated against them, because there's a sense of, okay, I must have contributed to this somehow. Obviously, you didn't. So for me, I'm like, okay, I didn't feel that shame. And so, yeah, in my TEDx talk, I said, like, you know, the shame should never be felt by the victim. The shame should be on the perpetrators, right? Because the perpetrators know better. They know they shouldn't be doing that. And yet, at the same time, they do decide to do that. So yeah, the shame is completely on them and not on me, you know, who happens to be, you know, the victim of their actions, right? So it's very much about that. But you still always have to encounter that word. When I did years ago, I did a radio interview for BBC Northern Ireland, and the actual interview was fine, right? But then they always kind of come up with like a clickbaity headline, right? So there was a headline, when it was tweeted out, the headline said, "I didn't tell my parents about the rape because of the shame," right? And I'm like, I never used the word shame in the interview, right? And like, so I had to go back to them, and this is a recurring theme. When you deal with the media, you have to actually like, I mean, I think I'm out in the Belfast Telegraph today, and I hope they've done a decent job. But like, you constantly have to be like, you know, arguing your own ground in some ways with the media, because they're always going to want to go for the clickbaity article headline. And I was like, can you take the word shame out of the headline? Because I never said that, right? And they're like, oh, all right, you know. But you know. And there's been other examples where I've written a piece for an online journal and sent them my headshot, not my headshot, but you know, my author photo, and they've gone through, yeah, I mean, they haven't used that. They've gone through like a video I've done and done a screen grab of one where I'm like, look like I'm in pain, and they use that as the lead image from my article, and I'm like, no, that's not the one I gave you. Go back and use the one I gave you. So that needing to stand up for yourself as a victim is exhausting, and yet that the media still will always kind of want to do their thing and reinforce those narratives about shame and pain and trauma in a way that I don't think is helpful overall.
No, absolutely not. Fourth wave feminist movement has really widened the conversation about what constitutes sexual abuse and harassment and victim shaming, body shaming, rape culture, misogyny. Your new novel, Complicit, is based within the film industry. Absolutely loved the book. It's fantastic. Would you like to give the audience a little flavour of what that book's about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Complicit, the idea for it came about in autumn of 2017, which, if you recall, then was when all the Harvey Weinstein allegations started going public, and then the other allegations about other powerful men in the film industry and other industries. So Dark Chapter had just come out a few months prior to that. And I remember thinking, like, okay, like, right, when I found out, I used to work in the film industry for years, so when I found out that Weinstein had been accused of this kind of behavior, these assaults, I wasn't surprised, right? Like, nobody in the industry was surprised. Like, Harvey had a reputation for treating women in a certain sleazy way. Obviously, there's a step between treating women in a sleazy way and outright assaults, but yeah, it didn't surprise anyone, right? But that sort of almost kind of casualness, where we're like, yeah, of course he did that, right? You know, I mean, even that is shocking. The fact that I had an attitude like that is shocking, because you become so inured to that sort of behavior in the industry. So people were saying to me, they're like, I don't understand, if this man was so powerful and was doing this for years, like, why was he able to get away with that? And I'm like, well, it was because he was so powerful, right? You know, and my sister asked, like, why didn't these women go to HR? And I'm like, well, there is no HR in the film industry, right? Or even if it's within a certain organization, they're always, the HR is always going to protect the big boss. They're not going to protect, you know, the young woman who's working as an assistant. So yeah, so I kind of realized, well, I used to work in film, and it'd be good to actually maybe write a book that kind of sheds light into what the industry is actually like. And, you know, my agent at the time said, well, you're now well known for writing kind of feminist sort of suspense, and you used to work in film, so maybe you'd be well positioned to write about the stuff that's happening. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe do I want to write another book about sexual assault? Like, it is quite draining to talk about in some ways, but then I'm like, but I could write about the film industry, or I could do it through the lens of the film industry, and what is it like to be a young woman in an industry where you're really ambitious, where you love cinema, where you're so willing to build your career in a way that makes you vulnerable because of the way the industry operates. So for me, it was about kind of revisiting those kind of crazy days in my 20s when I worked in film, and there was all the kind of supposed glamour, but that was also just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there were lots of parties, but there was a lot of hard work. There was a lot of kind of exploitation. There was a lot of unpaid work. There was a lot of kind of male sleaziness in the industry. So for me, I was like, okay, well, let's try to revisit that and see it from, a darker lens, given what we now know about people like Weinstein, but then also try to emphasize kind of the hope and the ambition that a young person would have had, and that sense of being seduced by the glamour of the industry and seduced by the joy of cinema, and also which kind of in some ways makes you blind to the stuff that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. It feels timely and very powerful what you've done with the book, and the reviews have been fabulous, Do you think fiction is the proper way or the most effective way for us to take the conversation beyond preaching to the converted?
Yeah, I think it's a very effective way, because I think, if you just wrote a nonfiction book and said, this is a book about, sexual assault, like, a lot of people aren't going to read it, right? Because, I mean, in some ways, yes, it's a topic that affects a lot of people, but it's also quite dark topic, right? And that's the problem we have when we're trying to address this issue. Everyone's like, oh, we don't want to talk about rape, right? It's like, it's too much. It's like, yeah, but it's also affected a lot of people out there. But there's a societal kind of like shrinking away from the issue, right? If you put something into fiction, and you'll know this yourself as a crime fiction writer, a lot of these issues about violence against women, about societal attitudes towards gender, about power, can be put into, in some ways an entertaining story with characters that we can relate to or hate in some ways. And that is sort of a safer sphere in some ways, because it allows the reader or the audience member to kind of, put whatever they want from their own personal experience and attach that to what they're seeing or reading. But you can always just also just close a book if it gets too much to read it, or you can stop watching a movie, right? Like, so the viewer, the reader has the option to control how they consume it. But then also there's that additional freedom of just thinking like, okay, this didn't happen in real life, but I can relate to this character. So I think that's in some ways it's an easier way to kind of reach people emotionally, as if you use fiction or the arts in some way.
And going back to sort of the language around victim shaming and the judicial system, and I felt very much that everything was stacked against the character Sarah in the novel. Do you feel in real life that's the case? Everything is stacked against the victim?
Yes, but I think it varies in each case. I mean, in my case, no. I mean, in my case, I can't say everything was stacked against the victim, because I was the victim. And if I look at myself demographically compared to what who my perpetrator was, I was 29. I was a former George Mitchell scholar, Harvard educated, obviously, quite articulate American. And okay, yes, like not white, but I mean, but that was kind of the only thing about me that didn't have a huge amount of cultural capital about my identity. And my perpetrator was a 15-year-old illiterate Irish traveler whose family had a history of criminality, right? So, I mean, yeah, the odds were not stacked against me in that case, but in most other cases, yeah, absolutely. In the case of every single Weinstein assault, odds are completely stacked against the victim, and that's why so many women were silenced. And if they chose not to speak out, they would still be silenced in a different way through NDAs, right? So yeah, I mean, it's very rare where the odds aren't stacked against the victim. So in my case, I don't think they were. But it's quite unusual, to find a situation like that. So I do think the criminal justice process, is incredibly damaging to victims. And even though the odds weren't stacked against me, to go through the process, I flew to Belfast 10 months after the assault, expecting to testify, and despite everything I've described, and obviously I'm comfortable speaking in public, I was still absolutely terrified. It was like the worst period of my life wasn't the assaults, because I was so much in shock about that, I just didn't understand what was happening. It was the dread of thinking I'm gonna have to fly back to Belfast and testify in court in front of my perpetrator in public, right? That was absolutely terrifying. And I can see why a lot of victims wouldn't want to go through that process. And unfortunately, the criminal justice process often banks on the fact that, okay, she's going to be so scared she's not actually going to testify, right? Which is why my perpetrator waited until the very last minute when I was in the courthouse, preparing to testify later that day, to plead guilty, right? So I mean, again, he could have done that at any previous point and saved me a lot of hassle and made it a lot easier for me. But I think the criminal justice process itself doesn't offer a lot of space for comforting or even caring about the mental health and the well-being of the victim, unfortunately.
Yeah. Are you in a place now where you feel you've written enough about sexual violence to move on, write other stories? Or is it always going to be a theme that inevitably runs through your creative life?
I can't say because I don't know what I'm gonna write. I mean, I'm working on my third book, and I'm toying with how much I want to have that issue filter into that third book. There's also this, in talking about the creative industry, is like once that issue of violence against women makes it into a book, is the book suddenly about that? In reality, in my life, yes, I do this, kind of professionally, I suppose, but like if I'm not speaking at a conference like this, or if I'm not doing media work, in my everyday life, I'm not necessarily thinking about violence against women, because like I have a kid now, I do lots of other things, right? And that's the narrative that we often don't see. There's a sense of, once you're a victim, that's it. That's the rest of your life, you're branded as that. And oftentimes in the media, that is, if somebody were to Google my name, okay, now they'll find my books, but like, probably quite soon you'll also find my TEDx talk. So like almost immediately I am branded as being a survivor of sexual violence. And that's quite understandably a brand that people don't necessarily want to have permanently. And yet also it's my kind of USP, within the creative, as novelist, right? I'm now known for addressing that issue. So as an artist, of course, there's other things I want to explore. Like I love travel. So there's an element of wanting to explore landscapes and geography and travel in my writing. And do I always have to address violence against women in doing that? Hopefully not. But yeah, I don't know. In my current novel, it's more about travel. It's about a road trip across the US. And I'm toying with how much I want to have that issue in there or not. But yeah, I mean, there's loads of other stuff I'd like to do that isn't about that issue. But then at the same time, I can't deny the fact that, once you've been through that trauma, that does become an element in your life, and you are much more aware of the issue in different ways, and you never know when the trauma's gonna come back at you. Like, I've had a pretty emotional past few days. Always flying to Belfast is always like quite emotionally complex for me. Just the thought of it, now that I'm actually here, I'm like, it is a lovely city, but just the thought, because I live far away, not that far, but I don't live in Belfast. Coming here, I'm always going to be thinking of the rape in some way.
Place is often connected to trauma, there's a lot of research around that. I'm very interested in the intersectional approach you've taken with the characters, Sarah, in the book. So we have race come into it, her lower socioeconomic background, as well as gender. Just quickly say something about that, and then we want to go to the audience and hear.
Do you want me to do a reading from Complicit, or?
It's up to you, Winnie, you decide.
Okay. How long do we have before I have to do that?
We've got 10 minutes.
Okay, okay. I mean, do people have questions or no?
Yeah,
okay.
it's a few notes.
Right, okay, so I would love to do a quick reading from Complicit, but then also, that's gonna eat into it. Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a quick reading. Obviously, Sarah is a child of Chinese immigrants, so that puts her in a different position in terms of trying to make her way in the industry. And Hugo, she's being interviewed by a journalist here. So Hugo is the Weinstein type character. Did Hugo ever ask you to get in contact with these actresses? I hesitate. I've been losing sleep these past few weeks, trying to separate what I did from what I suspected even that early on. And Sarah used to work as an assistant to him. Most probably he did ask me to set up meetings with these actresses, and I complied, just like Ziggy would have done. He was my boss after all. It wasn't my role to question him, was it? I just thought, okay, this is how Hugo operates. He has money, he likes to meet attractive young women who want to work in the industry. He's certainly not the first powerful, wealthy man to act like that. Well, what do you mean by that statement? I stare at Tom Gallagher and wonder how much easier this interview would be if he were a woman. Well, it's not just actresses who have to deal with this. In my experience as a young woman in the film industry, it is fairly standard that at some point, some guy you're working with will come onto you. It can be subtle, a middle-aged unit photographer to whom you have zero attraction, suggesting a pretty girl like you ought to have a drink. It can be more overt, an older actor you've worked with for months, suggesting you stay in his hotel room that night. And it can be shameless. A white-haired 60-something male film critic planting a wet kiss on your lips as you leave a party, his hand cradling your buttock. Such behavior was impossible to avoid. The rules seem to be, if you're a young woman in this industry, you're fair game. Well, how did you personally deal with that? I shrug. You construct a stoic facade to fend off the unwanted attention. I mean, I didn't in any of those 3 instances sleep with the male in question. I came up with some witty but firm response, hoping it was clear enough I was uninterested without having to be rude. Did it get tiring to deal with? Absolutely. Of course it's irritating. Of course the naive you is thinking that maybe this older male film critic is inviting you to events because he's interested in your thoughts on genre and female directors, when really he just wants to sleep with you. Eventually you stop being so naive. But the witty response, the ability to demonstrate a resourceful defense is key. Most importantly, you don't show weakness. Men are programmed to prey on weakness. Is that what you think? Well, not all men, of course, but in film, there's always a power imbalance. The powerful prey on the weak become disposable, expendable, and then vanish. So if you want to survive, you don't show your weakness.